Hello and welcome back. This is MC1 Gamer bringing you another video regarding Age of Sigmar Warhammer. There was a couple videos recently talking about different ideas, concepts, thoughts about the size of what an Age of Sigmar game is, notably Doom and Darkness, and more recently Vince Ventrello, who had put out a video talking, going through back from the heyday of 5th edition all the way up into recently, and showing a real good progression about what games of Warhammer really have looked like when it comes to fantasy, and showing some really good pictures that really it kind of brought me back to some of the old days. I'm going to give some full disclosure here. I've played since prior to 5th. 5th was kind of the real push that got me into it. I left for a while after 6th launched, and I really didn't see 7th at all, and came back, in after 8th released, and really took a deep dive into 8th edition with the vast sizes of the Warhammer armies at the time, with what 8th edition really was about, which is large armies, which is was really shown very well with Vince's progression video. So I definitely, anybody who hasn't seen it, go check it out. And of course, Doom and Darkness, had a really interesting take also. The bottom line here is, I started out at a similar time, and the armies were much different. If you had, I think the largest unit sizes that you had were maybe 20 strong, so like 4 rows of 5. So there's a lot of units that just had five guys, like 5 war dancers, 5, knights. A big unit of knights was 12 to 15. When it came to the Bretonians, you didn't see the night buses like you see now, and 12 to 15 is pretty big now too. But you could see in 8th edition or other, you would see some real hordes of knights even, but you'd see 40-man strong hordes, which was very, very uncommon, if not even not even really that much seen back in 5th edition, for example. But I saw it a couple times. I played some unbelievably big games back then, because that's what I had gotten to that point with the progression of my armies before I had sold them all and left. And by the way, I took about a decade off, got married, had a kid, built a family, got a house, and then got back into it after my son grew up a little bit more, and I had a little more time, and now he's playing. So in any case, just the idea of the small and medium-sized games and large games, 8th edition and some previous editions really absorbed the concept of what you could do with a large game very well within the structure of the game. I mean, large blocks of troops, large blocks of big ranks, several layers deep. It was also very easy to. It just made sense with the rule structure, and it was actually very much promoted based on how the game was built. But you didn't have to play it that way. It certainly could be played at smaller levels. But a lot of the community really introduced that within a point structure with that showed that there was some power to these Death Star type units, or large units with that could absorb punishment and still be able to dish it out with lots of attacks. I won't go into the whole theory craft of how 8th edition was played and whatnot. There's certainly people that were better at it than I was, and have put out endless videos. But the game is still played by those who want to keep that candle lit, and I bravo, if that's what you want to do. I'm sure I'll jump back into an 8th edition game at some point and play around with that. But I've moved on, and a lot of people have moved on, and new people are jumping into a game like Age of Sigmar. The thing that strikes me is that there's a lot of notions from the legacy players, and they're taking these conventions from earlier editions of Warhammer and trying to apply them to Age of Sigmar, and they don't always work. I played more games than I can count. I'm well into the 3 digits, and there's barely a week that goes by that I don't play, and play several games. I played games of all different sizes. I played from the smaller games when I was first testing, and I even do that now when I do demos, and do with newer players as they they're just getting a feel for the game. And I played very large games, and I have a perspective of that. And I'm sure there's some of you out there that have done that as well. And maybe you'll mimic and mirror and agree with some of my points, and maybe you won't. And I certainly like to hear and get a little bit more feedback on what your experiences have been, because that's something that anybody who's viewing this and trying to get an idea of maybe what that sweet spot might be on Age of Sigmar, or just want to get an idea of what they're getting into if they're playing a very large game, that it would be good to share that kind of information. So please feel free, but just please keep it positive overall. I don't want to let any negative anti-Age of Sigmar people coming in here and taking over those threads. If you have an opinion based on your experience and you want to share it in a constructive way, please feel free. But as far as my experiences with both small and large games, first of all, I think the game is much better at that small medium range. I have said it from the early stages of this game. Yes, there are units that get very good and actually it invites you to play with 30 plus strong and like skeletons and clan rats, and there's a lot of units rather, war scrolls, where the model count is a big deal. There's rules that are improved substantially based on that. Zombies is a good example. They're garbage, in a small collection of like 5 or 8. But once you get into the 10s, each increment, they get better. There's just that mass. It's very fluffy. I think it's the best rule for zombies yet, but it just makes sense. There's more of them. So the fact that there's a large crowd of them, a horde of them, the more of them there are, the easier it is for them to hit you because of the crush of the masses and to start and harm you. They're not going to get any better armor saves, but their ability to hit is improved with every increment of 10 up until I don't know if it stops at 30 or 40, I forget. And then their horde can actually, just organically combine as you more summoned or other units of them, get close to each other. They just inherently group up and become larger. So if you have 2 small units of them that are, really not that impressive, if they get together, they become this massive, entity, and it becomes really dangerous. And there's definitely a thing to that zombie horde now, more so than there ever has been. So those are things that are really the Age of Sigmar kind of encourages and pushes and prods you towards, and that's good. I don't have any issue with that. It's just that the game as a whole, collectively, there are disadvantages to, and there are different. There are some real hurdles that occur as you get to bigger games. You don't have as much of the crush with gigantic units, 40, 50, 100 strong in certain list type scenarios like you might have seen in 8th edition. But what you don't get in Age of Sigmar is the convenience of that movement, that easy movement tray that you might have, because things are all in skirmish. You might have that, you can still use, of course, your rank and file units in the square bases. Absolutely. I still have some of my units that are on squares, and they're slowly being converted to rounds. But, even with the squares, once you start getting into combat, you're jumping off those bases, and you might not return based on the nature of what's going on in the game. So it's really just the convenience of deploying, moving up initially, and then after that, you just kind of forget your trays. But in 8th edition, it was a great convenience, because all you did was remove stuff off the trays, unless you did some kind of reforming. Your block formation kind of had a coherency, and it was easy to move, and it was quicker. In Age of Sigmar, if you're moving 50 guys, you really need to move 50 guys, and that's only that one unit, and that can take time, and it can be, as much as it's, I think that it provides a huge flexibility in terms of formation. There's many tactical aspects to how you might apply your formation, where you might take casualties from the shapes, the layers of different units, and how they might apply based on their ranges and their other different abilities they might have. Better armored troops up front, missile weapons in the rear, spears in the center, stuff like that. Those are all real aspects of the game. But the physical aspect of moving all of those units, all of those individual models, can bog the game down heavily. And that's a real thing. So it kind of pushes away from the benefit of having very large games. So you have the time factor and just it being a pain to actually move all those guys, kind of compresses it asks you, it really begs for you to compress the game down. But let's look at some of the structure of the game. And I'm going to describe some benefits for larger games as well, but let's talk about really how the game is kind of built. The game is really built and is not to emulate 8th edition. A lot of players who are legacy players are coming from that game or even other games or similar games, and they may have seen videos, they may have seen tournaments, they may have seen stuff on the table, but more often than not, they're people who have played the more recent editions of Warhammer, and they're bringing those notions into Warhammer. That's what I've seen with a lot of the comps. I see a lot of comps that are trying to adjust Age of Sigmar to look like what it will look like in 8th edition. 0-2 heroes, 0-2 monsters, 0-2 war machines, or comps that heavily restrict you in terms of having more than that type of structure, where you really get punished points wise because they implement points, which I can't stand. I hate any of the point limitations on Age of Sigmar for a variety of reasons. But you can look at another video on why I believe that and why that's a good thing for the game and a good thing for gaming in general, in my opinion. But in terms of this, there's so many comps out there that are trying to twist it and make it look more like those older editions of Warhammer and are kind of diluting what Age of Sigmar can be and making it more bland and taking a lot of that flexibility and creativity out, because they want to try to make that game style more of a thing. And it doesn't work as well. It can work. It certainly can work. You can change this game any way you want with whatever comp or whatever adjustments of whatever your preferences are, but you lose a lot. In that regard, with that in mind, your the idea of trying to impose limits on a particular unit, you're encouraging other units to be larger to make up for that. You're trying to make these larger block units, even though they're more in a they're all in rounds and they can be in whatever cluster formation you want them to be, and then that lends to the idea that you'd have to move these large clusters of units, which takes time. But there's also other factors. You have in combat and in other phases, you have to record and keep track of various things. You certainly had to do that in previous games. But because the game is asking you to, especially in close combat, pick and choose the order of which you want to activate units, and it alternates, there's a lot of record keeping involved. And because there's a lot of synergies, more so than we saw in previous editions of Warhammer, more than ever before, there are synergies between units, between characters and units, and there's accelerator, force multiplier type abilities that are applied based on those synergies. If you don't know what I'm talking about, what I mean is that if you have a keyword in a particular unit and an ability with a hero that impacts that unit and enhances it, or several units, you have to that's a huge part of Age of Sigmar, and it's one of the ways to have even a smaller force be that much more powerful than what it may look like, or it is conveyed in just its simple war scroll and its stat profiles. Much more so even than what it might look like on the table in terms of the quantity of models, or even these larger models, which tend to be beefier than your smaller infantry troop types. The fact is that those synergies make them so much more powerful, give them so many more powers and dynamic abilities. And that's the kind of stuff that that you need to think about when you're building an army. It's nice to mix and match outside of maybe factions, or even within a specific type of a keyword. But with those synergies, the game opens up in a whole different dimension. It's far more than the 4 pages that we see in the core rulebook. But let's go further and let's establish that when you have these types of synergies, you can make a force that's impressive with less troops as a result. You don't need these massive armies. But what we're looking at here is that you have to keep track of all these different things, when they apply, how they, being able to say, okay, that no longer is in effect when you say, for instance, get down to a certain quantity number, or if there's a command ability or a spell ability or an innate ability that enhances these various units with these synergies. You got to keep track of this stuff. Sometimes they no longer work. Sometimes they may only exist when a character is present. Sometimes they have to, there's companies like LitGo that makes great tokens for this, or you can make your own. It's really not that hard, but they're more impressive, the ones that are out there on the market. Especially a lot of these laser cut, or acrylic type tokens. They're very cool, very easy to read, and they kind of help a lot. But it can be just about anything. Any little, these little crystal like tokens that people have to note things, but there's so many different types of effects, it's hard to know what that stands for. When you have individual things, you could have 3 or 4 different tokens that really just are next to a cluster of a unit or a character, and that really, you can immediately just jog your memory that, okay, these effects are in place. They can be negative impacts as well, negative effects. All these things are hard to keep track of, and they're especially hard to keep track of when you have a large army. And when it comes to close combat and you're alternating, this unit's been active versus that unit's been active, all of that has to be kept track of. I have tokens for activated units within the close combat phase. I rarely use them, but for large games, it's essential, because you need to know that if there's a dozen combats going on, and there could be more than a dozen units involved in these combats, in very large games, I'm talking mega battle size games, you need to know what's been activated. Maybe the turn before it was in a specific order and you're misremembering because of where he's been activated in a previous turn. But you've got to remember in this particular turn, those guys are still available. Those guys maybe already attacked. You need to denote that when you get into very large combats. That can be hard to keep track of. That's tough record keeping. In a smaller game or a medium-sized game, not so much. It can still be a challenge at times, but not so much. And a few tokens is not such a big deal. Having a dozen of the same token can be a big deal because there's an expense involved with that if you're buying it from a regular, a place that cuts it, makes it nice, look nice, and makes it a clear, clear message on that acrylic, colored token of what it stands for. So those are the types of things that definitely can have an impact on the game. And what I found is that even when you even approach the equivalent of a 2,500 point game, which was kind of the standard model for 8th edition for tournaments, for organized events, the game starts getting a little bogged down. Not so much that it's not manageable, but once you get bigger than that, I mean, I used to play 8th edition games, and certainly back in previous editions before I stepped away from the game for a while, I used to play 5,000-6,000 point games. It was not unheard of. It was very common. The only time I would ever play a 2,500 or a 1,500 point type game was in an organized event. So keeping track of what went on was easy because it was one person did everything all at once on their side. You didn't do any alternating. In Age of Sigmar with the alternating, you got to keep track. You got to keep the person on the other side of the table and on your turn is still involved and still has to make decisions. They can be on the offensive just as much as you can. So you need to keep track of that stuff. So that is a big deal when it comes to these large games. I play very large games now. When I talk about mega battles, I've got one that's coming up this coming Saturday, and I've got others that are planned. This one is and I mentioned this on other videos, but if you don't know, I obviously have a very large undead army. I have a Nagash conversion that uses the main box that came out last year, but I've changed it and updated it to my preference. And I don't know if I'm going to get to put it on a very large round or oval before this game, so it's still going to be on the big rectangular base it was on, but I'm going to probably do that at some point because I have a couple other mega battles already being scheduled for this. But this is going to be Nagash with a story-driven, battle with anybody who's coming down to the store to participate. They're going to bring some small and medium-sized factions, and there could be a huge array of troops depending on how many people show up to this event. But we're talking on my side. I mean, I just unfortunately sold off almost 200 of my zombies going back maybe a few weeks, or it was maybe about a month ago, and I wish I hadn't because I kind of need them now. But I still have over 100 of them. I have maybe about 125 zombies still now. I've got over 100 skeletons, and I just mashed up a bunch that are trying to fit my Bretonnian undead profile. But I've still got a bunch of the other ones, and I've converted all those onto rounds. So that was a big job, and converted all about maybe 2/3 of my zombies onto rounds. The rest are still on squares. There's got to be like 20 crypt horrors. I think it's like 6 or 8 of the Vargeists, 3 Vargulfs, 2 Mortis engines now. Let's see, I've got 2 of the Mortarks. I don't have all 3. There's 8 of the Morghasts. So there's a pretty good size. I mean, I can go on. There's a pretty good sized army here. There's probably about 40 or 50 of the Grave Guard. There's stuff. I'm not even talking about Blood Knights and Hex Wraiths and stuff like that. There's a lot in this army, and a lot of it's going to be summon fodder. It's a huge, huge army. I've actually, contemplated whether or not I should do it in tandem with somebody else so that we can do stuff simultaneously. But one of the people that I was going to ask was not available. So and I was actually going to borrow some of this stuff, but I don't really think I need it. I think even if I'm up against a ridiculous number of players with their armies, I think it's going to come down to the fact that I can summon stuff back, even though they're going to have summoning. There's stuff in the scenario that's going to promote these. It's going to be a massive, massive game. We're going to have 8 tables just for this game. And the biggest thing, and without going into, I've explained to you what this looks like, just to give you a perspective of what we're talking about here. I have an array of tokens prepared to try to keep track of all these different things, and believe me, it's going to be a challenge. I played a game that was very big like this with an 8th edition. I played a couple of them, but nothing this big. And the next one that's got planned is going to be a forces of chaos helmed by Archaon versus the forces of death helmed by Nagash, and factions joining one of either side. And that's going to be even bigger than this. And that's going to be at another shop. So we just started talking with Colt from Brooklyn Strategist about that. I think that one might be even bigger. It depends on how big he goes with his army and how many Varangian he buys. But in any case, these are going to be challenges. It requires more people involved in these games, because you have so much more to keep track of. It's a lot for one person. Playing even a 2,500 point game equivalent in Age of Sigmar requires some record keeping, and it can slow the game down. And the bigger you go, the slower it gets because of it. So these are some of the issues that I have with very large games. Can you do it? Sure. Can you do it? Can you play a game of Risk in 8 hours? You know, I've played Game of Risk where there was enough people to take over one continent, and then we just, you start with like eight people, maybe, 9 people playing a game. If you can finish that game, it better be done over several sessions, because it just doesn't happen. There are games out there that take very long periods of time, and if that's what you're looking to get into and you like that, great. You're not going to be using those models in the interim for smaller games. They're going to be devoted to that particular game, but you can do it, and that's an appeal to some people. I like it. I just don't want to do it all the time. But with that in mind, let's talk about why I think Age of Sigmar is even more so better played at small and medium-sized games. And that is because these games don't and should not exist in a vacuum. Sure, you can play one scenario, one-off games, even in an event, even if you're not in an event, if that's all the time you have, and I mean that's all that's in your collection, sure, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no wrong size game in Age of Sigmar. There's no wrong. Your fun is not wrong. I love that line. That's going to be on a T-shirt. It's a new motto of mine. Your fun is not wrong. I may disagree with you on rules, and you may disagree with me on rules, but if that's what your fun is, then you're not wrong. You'll never be wrong. That's what you enjoy. Go play that. And no matter how much passion I am about a particular rules interpretation or how I feel about certain ways to play the game, it has no bearing on what your fun is, if that's what you decide you want to do. So please understand that when I say these things. But Age of Sigmar is best played, and it functions best in its structure at a small and medium-sized game. It can be done now down to the warband or even single models, but it could also, I think it functions better when you have a small collection of units, 2 to 4 units, maybe 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 units in different types, and medium-sized games where you have as much as 8 or 10. Once you get past that, now when I'm talking about units, I mean one unit. It could be one war scroll of any type. It could be a war scroll with 30 skeletons. It could be a war scroll with 1 dragon. It could be one hero. Once you get bigger than that, because invariably that 8 or 10 is going to be a collection of different types. But once you get bigger than that, each of those units is going to have a collection of guys, anywhere from 3 to 20, or more. And so when you have 4 or 5 of those, then that's when you get to bigger games. But when there's going to be some single characters, monsters, or war machines in those collectively, sure. So that's what actually helps bring down the quantity of models, even though some of them are much bigger. But let's just establish that if I'm in a general sense, that's what I'm talking about. Small games are anywhere from 2 to 4 picks from war scrolls, and medium-sized games, in my opinion, I guess anywhere from the 6 to 8 or 6 to 10 range. Once you get past that, you're getting into bigger games. The reason why I think it works better in the small to medium size is because the way the game is really best played is strings of games, scenarios that are linked, scenarios that have impacts on the next games. I've talked about this in the scenario video. I've talked about this in videos in the first, within the first month of Age of Sigmar releasing, when I first was talking about it after starting to test it, when I first started, putting out unlocking videos. The idea is that these are narrative games. You can change it and twist it and comp it into like a tournament style steamroller type event. Sure, you can do that. But the way it's built, with all the scenarios that have come out, with all the different books that have come out, there's 8 or 10 scenarios, or maybe 6 or 8 scenarios in every one of those. And you can buy them on digital download. There's probably about 50 different scenarios that are released right now officially by GW. Not even take into consideration the type of scenarios that people have built for events or just on their own home games. And it's not that hard to do. You can make very simple scenarios that can really make the game more interesting, just with a couple of different thoughts involved. Where you're playing, what if you're playing on a particular plane, if you have certain objectives that change, how you might maneuver rather than just run at each other and kill. But you have a series of connected scenarios where the first game has an impact on the next game, and the objectives in there have implications on whether or not you succeed or whether or not you get some kind of a boon in the follow-up game. There's a reason why triumphs were mentioned, even though they were very, very bland and not fleshed out in the main core 4-page rulebook. They kind of illustrate that they're looking for you to take these games and have them interconnected. And if you play 3 or 4 games within a game day, and they're in the small to medium size range, that is completely doable, probably within the time that you could play one hefty game from 8th edition, a game anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 points. You can probably get 3 games in this size that I'm suggesting. And that could be a story. I said many times on my channel and other people's channels, and had conversations certainly in person, and had various different hangout conversations. I've talked about this everywhere, about the concept of having, say, a Last Stand of the 300 equivalent in Warhammer. You couldn't do this in 8th edition, certainly not the way I suggested, certainly not the way you could do it in Age of Sigmar. But these could be imbalanced games of various different sizes with objectives that are incremental within, say, an invasion or a small war campaign, which progress. You could have an invading army hit the beach and hit a token force defending the beach. Again, imbalanced. A large force against a smaller one. But the amount of time, the amount of impact that that the defending force, what it does and how long it can hold out can impact the next game, which could be maybe at a forward defensive fort. And the next game could be a pass where, it's before you get to the stronghold keep. Could be a dwarven stronghold, could be whatever. The bottom line is each of these games have impacts, and they have objectives that the invader needs to achieve and the defender needs to prevent. And the idea of all of that having connected within a string of scenario-driven games in an overall narrative is how you play this game. Can you do that in one game day if every game is the equivalent of a 8th edition tournament list of 2,500 points? No. 100 wounds is a lot. Even though all wounds are not equal, if you collectively add up 100 wounds, you're talking about a fairly decent sized game. You go up to 150 or 200, which is some of the stuff that some of my fellow gaming grunts guys have been suggesting for our games. You bog stuff down. And it takes longer times to achieve goals, to make decisions, to move your troops. I'm at a struggle right now with my colleagues in Gamer Grunts because they like the 150 point mark. They wanted to start at 200 wounds. And I've been telling them, no, we need to get down to 100. 100 is probably, the best threshold for about an hour and a half, hour long game. Again, depending on your skill level and, depending on what your army list looks like, because you might have a larger model counter versus somebody smaller with the same wound structure. But still, the point is that you get to these bigger games with more units on the table, it snowballs. So I think that, again, the preference is up to you, whatever you want to play. Just realize that if you're looking to play the strings of scenarios, a narrative-driven type campaign type thing, and you could do that in one day. You're not playing skirmish games. You're not playing War Machine. You're not playing Mordheim. You still can play a very robust and very deep level tactical game with reasonably, smaller armies and even mid-sized armies, and still have a much more interesting gameplay because of the connectivity of several games in one session, sitting down and playing with one or more people, and versus playing a monstrous game. Now, you want to play a very big game, great. You just got to realize it's going to take more time and it's going to involve more record keeping. And if that's your style, wonderful. But I think that the sweet spot for newer players especially is going to be in that small size game. I really encourage people to try playing small and medium sized games. And if you like the big games, work your way up. It depends on what your collection looks like as well, but it also depends on your play style. But think about also the time factor and all of, having to, keep track of everything that's going on. It might be daunting, and it could be turn you off to what this game looks like, what this game actually, the play style of the game. Try it in small, medium-sized games, see how that play works, and work your way up and see if you like it when it gets to the bigger size, the larger scale. And if that's not your thing, you'll find very quickly when you play enough games what you like. And there's my response to that topic. Have a great day, everybody.